Laura Matthews wasn't fired. That would have hurt less. Instead, after making Cross Dynamics millions of dollars, after becoming the company's top sales executive for 3 years straight, she was forced to stand there, while the chairman handed her dream job to his own son. Effective immediately. Richard Cross will be your new director of sales. The room erupted into applause. But Laura wasn't looking at Richard. She was looking at the same people who, just minutes earlier, had congratulated her on a promotion they were certain she'd earned. 3 years as the company's top sales executive. 10 years of loyalty. Millions of dollars in revenue. Replaced by a man who had worked there for just 3 months. Nobody in that room realized they had just made the most expensive decision in Cross Dynamics history. Because the woman quietly walking away with nothing more than a cardboard box would one day return with the power to destroy everything they had built. By the end of her comeback, someone would lose a fortune. Someone would lose a company. And the chairman who chose his own son over the woman who made him rich would discover that nepotism has a price. But none of them knew that yet. Before we take you back to the day everything changed, take 1 second to tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever worked hard only to watch someone else get rewarded because of favoritism, hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like Laura's remind us that sometimes the greatest comeback begins with the greatest betrayal. Now let's go back to where it all started. The sales floor at Cross Dynamics had spent 3 weeks waiting for one name. For 3 consecutive years, Laura Matthews had been the company's top-performing sales executive. She had rebuilt accounts everyone else had written off, mentored half the junior staff without being asked, and quietly become the person clients called when nothing else was working. Most people in the building had already decided how today would end. 2 co-workers had stopped by her desk that week to say the job was basically hers. One had joked about picking a restaurant for after work. Another had started calling her boss, just to see if it would stick. Laura smiled every time, but she hadn't let herself believe it. Not yet. At 9 sharp, the department gathered in the glass-walled conference room. Chairman William Cross walked in first. Beside him, dressed a little too sharply for someone 3 months into the company, was his son, Richard Cross. William praised his son's fresh perspective and leadership instincts for almost a full minute before he said the words everyone was waiting for. Effective today, Richard will be stepping in as our new director of sales. The room went quiet. Then, slowly the applause started. Within seconds the same people who had spent the week telling Laura the job was hers were shaking Richard's hand, telling him the department needed someone with his energy. Someone called him the future of the company. Nobody looked at Laura. She stayed where she was, near the back wall, watching nearly 10 years of work lose to 3 months and a last name. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply understood, in the space of that one sentence, exactly what her decade at Cross Dynamics had actually been worth to the people running it. When the meeting broke, Laura found her supervisor, Martin Hayes, by the coffee station. "I'm going to head out early if that's all right." Martin didn't ask why. He already knew. "You were just unlucky this time," he said, and meant it kindly, which somehow made it worse. "Your turn will come." Laura thanked him, picked up the cardboard file box she kept under her desk for exactly this kind of day, and walked the length of the office. A few people glanced up. Most didn't. Near the elevators, Richard was already surrounded, laughing at something, shaking another hand. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The drive home was quiet. Instead of falling apart, Laura stopped for Chinese takeout and the almond cookies her mother liked from the bakery on 5th. She refused to let one meeting decide the rest of her day, or worse, the rest of theirs. Her mother noticed something the moment Laura walked in. She always did, but Laura only said the promotion had been delayed. Her mother believed her because Laura had never once given her a reason not to. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and Laura talked about everything except Cross Dynamics. It was only after her mother had gone to bed that Laura sat by the window, box still packed by the door, staring out at nothing in particular, doing the quiet arithmetic of what 10 years of loyalty had actually bought her. 9 years earlier, Laura Matthews was 17, and her father had been dead less than a year. He'd gone quickly, a heart that gave out on an ordinary Tuesday, and left behind a mortgage, a stack of unopened bills, and a wife who suddenly had to raise 2 incomes worth of expenses on one job. Laura's mother took whatever hours the cleaning company would give her, sometimes 2 buildings a night, coming home after midnight smelling of bleach and floor wax, too tired to do anything but sleep before the next shift started. So Laura became the one who ran the house. She learned to stretch a grocery budget until it groaned. She learned which bills could wait a week and which couldn't wait a day. She cooked dinner most nights, did the books at the kitchen table with a calculator and her mother's checkbook, and still found a way to keep her grades from slipping, because some stubborn part of her refused to let grief turn into an excuse. In the evenings after the dishes were done, Laura studied. Not just homework, she read everything she could find about the people who built things. Business biographies from the library. Old magazine profiles of executives she'd never meet. She filled 3 spiral notebooks with ideas she had no way to test yet: how a company should treat its customers, why most salespeople talk too much and listen too little, what it might mean to build something instead of just working for it. She had never sold anything in her life. She believed in it anyway. She believed, with the kind of certainty only a 17-year-old who has already lost too much can carry, that business was the one thing that could actually change where a family like hers ended up. Then her mother collapsed at work. It wasn't dramatic. She simply didn't get back up fast enough one morning, and a coworker called an ambulance. The doctors used the word exhaustion like it was a minor thing, but Laura understood what it really meant. Her mother's body had been running on borrowed time for a year, and there was no one left to catch what fell if it stopped. Laura made the decision in a single night. College could wait. Would have to. She took a full-time job at a retail counter the following week, and picked up a second one on weekends. When her uncle heard she'd deferred her acceptance letter, he didn't try to hide what he thought of it. "People like us don't become executives," he told her, not unkindly, just certain, the way people are certain about things they've decided not to question. "You're smart to be realistic." Laura didn't argue with him. She never argued with anyone about it. She simply kept working, kept filling notebooks on her lunch breaks, and let her uncle believe whatever made sense to him. 8 months later, a listing for a junior administrative assistant at Cross Dynamics caught her eye. The pay was barely better than retail. Most people who saw the posting would have scrolled past it without a second thought. Laura saw a door. She got the job, and from her first week she treated it like something worth more than the title suggested. She learned the names of people 3 floors above her pay grade. She sat in on meetings she wasn't required to attend, just to listen. She asked the accounting team how invoicing worked, asked marketing how they chose which clients to chase, volunteered for every task no one else wanted because every task taught her something about how the company actually moved. Within a year, people had stopped introducing her as the assistant. They introduced her as Laura, the one who actually knew how things worked. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, not long after that, when the trouble started. One of the company's largest clients, our account worth more than most departments' annual budgets, called to say they were done. Done with the service, done with the excuses, done with Cross Dynamics entirely. Executives filled the conference room in a panic that spread the way panic always does, fast and useless. Voices talked over each other. No one had an answer. Laura stood quietly near the back of the room, the way she always did, and waited for a gap in the noise. Then she asked the only question nobody else had thought to ask. "What exactly is the problem?" Nobody answered her at first. They were too busy talking over each other about discounts, concessions, anything that might buy the client back with money. Laura wasn't asking about money. She pulled the account file, read through 6 months of correspondence nobody else had bothered to reread, and saw what everyone had missed. The client wasn't leaving over price. They were leaving because every person who'd handled their account had treated them like a line item instead of a business with its own particular problems. She stayed past midnight building something no one had asked her for. A retention strategy built around what the client actually needed, not what Cross Dynamics found easiest to sell them. By morning, she handed it to the account director like it was nothing. It worked. The client stayed. The company kept a contract worth millions, and for one afternoon, everyone in that building knew exactly whose idea had saved it. Word moved fast after that. Whenever an account started slipping, someone would eventually say the same thing. Get Laura on it. She fixed what other people couldn't, quietly and without drama, until the nickname stuck to her whether she wanted it or not. The closer. Clients began asking for her by name. Revenue on her accounts climbed in a way that made other departments start paying attention. She had become, without a title to prove it, one of the most valuable people in the building. But value and credit didn't always travel together. More than once, Laura sat in the back of a board meeting and watched a senior manager present one of her retention systems as his own idea, nodding along to praise for work he hadn't done. Afterward, in private, the same executives would thank her, tell her they knew where the idea had really come from. In public, they let someone else take the promotion. Laura told herself it didn't matter. Recognition would come eventually, it had to. Hard work always won in the end. She kept working like she believed it. The years that followed blurred into a steady climb. She earned every internal certification the company offered. She built relationships with clients in cities she'd never lived in, the kind of trust that outlasted whoever happened to be managing the account. She won Employee of the Year. Then Top Saleswoman. Once, then again, then a third consecutive year, a streak no one else in the company's history had matched. By the time her third title was announced, the outcome of the next promotion felt like a formality. Directors had started referring to her, half-jokingly, as the department's future. Even people who'd never spoken to her directly assumed they already knew how the story ended. That was the shape of things 3 months before everything changed. Chairman William Cross called a department meeting to introduce someone new. His son. Richard Cross walked in looking like he'd been built for the job before he'd ever done it, well-dressed, well-spoken, a business degree from a school people recognized on sight. He had never closed a single account in his life, but he had the kind of ease that made people assume he must be good at something. Laura welcomed him the way she welcomed anyone new. She introduced him around, offered to walk him through the client files, told him honestly that she hoped he'd do well. She meant it. Richard smiled through all of it, but she caught something underneath the smile. A flicker every time someone in the room deferred to her instead of him, every time a coworker answered his question by saying, "Ask Laura, she'd know better." By the end of his first week, the smile had thinned considerably. He never said anything about it. He didn't have to. Then the board made its announcement, an executive leadership competition. Laura and Richard would each present a vision for the future of the sales division, and everyone understood, without needing to be told, that whoever won that room would very likely win the title that came with it. Laura began preparing immediately, the way she prepared for everything. Thoroughly, honestly, certain that the work would speak for itself. Richard didn't ask her for advice. He went to see his father instead. The competition that would decide Laura's future had officially begun. Both of them were given 1 week. That was the extent of the fairness. 1 week to prepare a vision for the future of the sales division, delivered to the board, with the director of sales title waiting for whoever made the stronger case. Around the office, most people treated the week as a formality. Laura had been running the department in every way that mattered for years. The title was the only thing missing. Richard told anyone who'd listen that he wasn't worried. Privately, he spent most of that week in his office with the door closed, aware in a way he hadn't been before that he had never actually built anything the board could ask him about. Laura presented first. She skipped the polish. No dramatic slides, no rehearsed flourishes. Just data laid out plainly, showing exactly why Cross Dynamics had been quietly losing customer loyalty for years and precisely what to do about it. She walked the board through a new retention strategy, a sales training overhaul, a case for choosing long-term client relationships over short-term numbers, and a mentorship system that would put people like she'd once been on a faster path than she'd had. She closed with a 5-year growth plan built entirely on the company's own numbers. The board pushed back hard, the way they did with anyone they took seriously. Laura answered every question without hesitation, because she'd already lived every scenario they were asking about. By the end, even the executives who'd walked in skeptical were nodding. Only William Cross gave nothing away. He sat through the entire presentation with the same unreadable expression, and Laura told herself that was simply his way. Richard went next. His slides were sharp, professionally designed, full of language that sounded impressive without saying much. It held together until the question started. When a board member asked how he planned to address declining client satisfaction, he circled the answer twice without landing on one. When another pressed him on retention numbers, he deferred to a broader strategic vision that never quite arrived. Several directors exchanged a look Laura recognized immediately, the look people give each other when they already know how something is going to end. She let herself believe, just for a moment, that it was going to end the right way. By the next morning, half the department seemed to agree with her. Martin found her by the coffee station and said, without hesitation, that he didn't think anyone could have topped what she'd presented. 2 senior managers had already started referring to her as our incoming director, casually, like it was settled. For the first time in years, Laura let the hope in all the way. Not carefully. Not guarded. All the way. That afternoon, the company gathered in the auditorium. William Cross opened by praising Laura directly at length, calling her one of the finest sales professionals the company had ever produced. Laura smiled, certain now ready. Effective immediately, William said, Richard Cross will serve as director of sales. The silence afterward had a texture to it. Laura's smile didn't disappear so much as it simply stopped meaning anything. The applause started somewhere behind her and reached her a half-second late, as if it had to travel through something to get there. Richard walked forward and shook his father's hand while the room rose around him. Laura stayed exactly where she was, watching a decade of work rearrange itself into something smaller, while the celebration moved past her like she wasn't standing in the middle of it. Afterward, Richard found her near the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for setting such a good example." He said it warmly like it cost him nothing. Laura congratulated him. "She meant every word of it the way you mean something you've decided to survive rather than feel." Then she walked away, unhurried, spine straight, the same way she walked away from everything that tried to take something from her. Richard watched her go. He noticed, the way he'd been noticing for weeks now, that people's eyes followed her out of the room instead of staying on him. He had the title. He didn't have the room. Alone in his new office that evening, he said the thought out loud, quietly, to no one. "As long as she's here, I'll never truly be in charge." Richard had the title. He learned quickly that a title wasn't the same thing as the room. Employees still came to Laura first, out of habit as much as trust. A contract question, a difficult client, a decision that needed someone who'd actually seen it before. Department managers ran things past her before they ran them past him. Clients still asked for her by name, as if the org chart hadn't changed at all. Every one of those small, ordinary moments landed on Richard like proof of something he didn't want to admit. So he started changing things. He dismantled the retention systems Laura had spent years building, replacing them with initiatives that looked better in a slide deck than they performed in practice. Experienced account managers were quietly reassigned to smaller territories. A handful of younger employees, ones who'd made a habit of agreeing with him in meetings, were promoted ahead of people who'd actually earned it. When Laura raised concerns, carefully, professionally, the way she raised everything, Richard heard a challenge instead of a warning. The results came fast. Within weeks, longtime clients were calling to complain. A few ended contracts outright. The department's numbers, steady for years, began to slide. Richard explained it away every time: the market, the timing, a difficult quarter, to everyone except himself. Privately, he decided the real problem was Laura, and the fact that people still trusted her more than they trusted him. She kept working anyway. Whenever an account wobbled, she quietly stepped in and repaired what Richard's changes had broken, the same way she always had. Executives thanked her in private the way they always had too. In public, Richard said nothing about her role in any of it. The silence had a shape to it now, one Laura had learned to recognize. It was a Thursday evening, well past when most of the floor had gone home, when Laura came back for a folder she'd left at her desk. The lights in the executive wing were still on. As she passed the conference room, she heard Richard's voice through the door, low and certain, talking to two senior managers. She stopped without meaning to. "I'm tired of everyone treating Laura like she's running this department," Richard was saying. Then he laid it out, piece by piece, like a plan he'd already rehearsed. Pull her off the premium accounts. Assign her quarterly targets no one could realistically hit. Give her the clients everyone else avoided. Let her performance reviews start reflecting all of it. Build a file, quietly, that would justify letting her go when the time came. One of the managers hesitated. Said something too quiet for Laura to make out, something that sounded like a question or maybe an objection. "My father owns this company," Richard said. Nobody spoke after that. Laura didn't wait to hear anything else. She walked back the way she'd come, calm on the outside in a way that felt almost separate from the rest of her, and didn't stop until she reached her car in the empty lot. She sat there for a long time. She didn't cry. She'd expected, somehow, that this moment, whenever it eventually came, would feel like the bottom of something. Instead it felt like clarity, sharp and unwelcome. The promotion hadn't been the end of what Richard was willing to do. It had only ever been the beginning, the first small piece of something larger he intended to finish. She thought about the last decade. The nights spent building strategies other people took credit for. The clients she'd saved without being asked. The 3 years of titles that had all led, somehow, to a man planning her exit in a room with the lights still on, certain enough of himself to say his father's name out loud like it settled the matter. It did settle something. Just not the thing Richard meant it to. Laura started the car and drove home in silence, turning the decision over the whole way, until by the time she pulled into her driveway it wasn't really a decision anymore. It was just a fact she hadn't said out loud yet. The next morning, before she'd even finished her coffee, Laura sat down at her desk and printed one document. Her resignation letter. Laura spent the weekend turning the decision over, looking for a version of it that didn't hurt. There wasn't one. If she stayed, she already knew how it would go. The impossible targets, the quiet paper trail, the slow, deliberate erosion of a reputation she'd spent almost 10 years building one saved account at a time. If she left, she had nothing waiting for her. No offer, no plan, no guarantee that any of those 10 years would mean anything outside the walls that had witnessed them. Staying meant losing on Richard's terms. Leaving meant losing on her own. She sat with that difference for a long time. On Sunday night, she finally told her mother everything. The promotion, the overheard meeting, the plan Richard had laid out like it was already decided. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when Laura finished, she didn't offer comfort so much as clarity. Never stay, she said, where your value has to compete with someone's last name. Laura sat with that sentence long after her mother had gone to bed. It didn't make the fear go away. It made the decision simple. Monday morning, she walked into Martin Hayes' office and set the letter on his desk before she could talk herself out of it. Martin read it twice like the words might change the second time. Laura, he started, then stopped, then tried again. He asked her to reconsider. Told her the department needed her, that things could still be fixed, that she'd worked too hard to walk away over this. Laura only smiled. I've already made my decision. The news moved through the office before lunch. People stopped by her desk in twos and threes, some to say they were sorry, a few to admit, quietly, that they should have said something the day of the promotion and hadn't. Laura held none of it against them. She thanked each of them, meant it, and kept packing. Richard found her near the end of the afternoon. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, uncertain. Like he'd expected an argument, maybe a scene, something he could point to later to justify what he'd already planned. Laura gave him nothing to point to. She said goodbye, civil and composed, and went back to her box. It was the same box she'd carried out of the auditorium the day of the promotion, brought back into service for one last use. She filled it with what remained of 10 years, a few photos, a mug, file she had every right to keep. At the door, she paused and looked back at the floor she'd spent nearly a decade learning by heart. Then she walked out. No speech. No parting shot at Richard or his father. Just the box and her spine straight the whole way to the elevator. The weeks after were harder than she'd let herself expect. Interview after interview went the same way. Recruiters lit up at the name Cross Dynamics on her resume and then asked some version of the same question. So what exactly did you lead? There was no clean answer. She'd built systems other people had presented as their own. She'd saved accounts under other executives' names. On paper, she had a decade of experience and almost nothing to show for it that a stranger could verify. She began to understand, slowly and unpleasantly, that she had spent 10 years building someone else's reputation instead of her own. Her savings thinned faster than she wanted to admit. Bills that used to be routine started keeping her up at night. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Laura questioned whether the decision had been the right one after all. She was still asking herself that question on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she walked into a small shared office space above a coffee shop, there for an interview she'd almost canceled twice. The name on the glass door read Bridgepoint Solutions. Inside there was exactly one desk, a whiteboard covered in handwriting, and one person. He stood when she walked in, smiling like he already knew something she didn't. I've been hoping, Daniel Carter said, someone exactly like you would walk through that door. Laura had walked into enough interviews by then to know what a company looked like when it was pretending to be more than it was. Bridgepoint didn't bother pretending. 4 desks, only 3 of them occupied. Computers old enough to hum audibly. A meeting room barely large enough for the small table wedged inside it, and a whiteboard covered floor to ceiling in handwriting, goals, numbers, arrows connecting ideas to other ideas. It was, by any reasonable measure, a company running on hope more than money. Daniel Carter greeted her like he'd been waiting all morning, which as it turned out, he had. He didn't ask about her job title. He told her plainly that he already knew who she was, not from a resume, but from 3 former Cross Dynamics clients who'd mentioned, unprompted, that the real reason the company had held on to them for so long was a woman named Laura Matthews. Nobody had told him that. He'd simply asked around and the same name kept coming back. It was the first time since she'd resigned that someone had looked past the company on her resume and seen the work underneath it. Daniel explained what Bridgepoint actually did, not chase new customers the way every other firm in the industry did, but help businesses keep the ones they already had. Laura found herself smiling before she meant to. It was the same philosophy she'd been building her entire career on, just spoken out loud for the first time by someone else. Daniel offered her a salary generous enough to raise her eyebrows. Laura shook her head. I don't want another paycheck, she said. Daniel looked confused. I want ownership. She explained it plainly, 10 years spent building something that was never hers, ideas that carried other people's names, a title that had gone to someone else despite everything she'd earned. She wasn't willing to do that twice. Daniel hesitated. Bridgepoint was everything he had. Giving up half of it felt like giving up the company itself. Laura slid a notebook across the table instead of arguing. Inside were pages of real plans: national expansion, a rebuilt sales structure, a retention model, enterprise partnerships, revenue projections built from numbers she actually understood. He read every page. It took him most of the afternoon. When he finally closed the notebook, he stood, extended his hand, and said, 50%. Laura shook it. For the first time in years, someone had bet on her instead of her title. The months that followed moved fast. Laura rebuilt Bridgepoint's sales operation from the ground up. A real structure, a mentorship program for new hires, leadership development, a customer success team built around the same principle Daniel had described that first afternoon. Keep the people you already have. Growth followed almost immediately. Clients who stayed became clients who referred others. The 4 desks became 6, then a dozen. Back at Cross Dynamics, word eventually reached Richard that Laura had joined a startup nobody had heard of. He laughed about it in a meeting loudly enough for it to travel. "She'll be back looking for a job within 6 months, he said, and the room laughed with him. Nobody noticed the irony in it, that he was underestimating her for the second time, in exactly the same way that had cost him nothing the first time and would cost him a great deal the second. A year later, Bridgepoint closed its largest contract yet, a client twice the size of anything they'd landed before. The office celebrated with cheap champagne in paper cups, because nobody had gotten around to buying real glasses. Daniel found Laura afterward, quieter than the rest of the room. "We're not just trying to survive anymore," he said. "We're competing." Laura believed him. She had no way of knowing, standing in that small office with champagne going flat in her hand, that the client they'd just won had walked away from a contract with Cross Dynamics to sign with them instead, or that, across town, Richard Cross was staring at a termination notice with a name on it he recognized immediately, realizing for the first time that the tiny company he'd laughed about was no longer something he could afford to ignore. The next 3 years moved faster than Laura had time to notice. Bridgepoint grew from 4 employees to over 300. One cramped office became a handful of regional branches, each one built on the same principle Daniel had described that first rainy afternoon. What had been an unknown startup became a name people in the industry recognized on sight. Magazines profiled Laura as one of the sharpest strategists in the business. Podcasts asked for her time. Conference organizers put her name on programs next to people she'd once studied out of library books as a teenager. For the first time in her career, the recognition had her name on it. Not a company's. Hers. Cross Dynamics, meanwhile, was falling apart in slow motion. Richard's leadership had a pattern by then, one that repeated itself across every department. He rewarded appearance over performance, promoted people for loyalty rather than competence, and treated customer complaints as inconveniences rather than warnings. Employee development budgets were the first thing cut whenever a quarter looked weak. Long-term client relationships gave way to short-term numbers, the exact trade Laura had warned the board against years earlier. The clients started leaving. One large account, then another, then 5 more in the span of a single quarter. Experienced employees began resigning quietly, without much explanation. A number of them turned up not long after on Bridgepoint's growing roster. William Cross watched the decline for longer than he should have before he finally confronted his son directly. Richard had an answer ready for every question: the economy, difficult employees, unfair competition, unreasonable clients. An answer for everything except the one place it actually belonged. William left that conversation with a question of his own, one he didn't say out loud: whether promoting Richard over Laura had been the single worst decision of his career. Through all of it, Laura never said a word against her former employer. Reporters asked more than once, hoping for something sharp they could print. She gave them the same answer every time. "I learned many valuable lessons there." Daniel noticed how carefully she avoided the opening. When he asked her about it, she just shrugged. "I don't need revenge," she said. "Success speaks louder." The end, when it came quickly. Cross Dynamics shareholders, watching revenue collapse and debt climb past what the company could reasonably carry, forced the board's hand. Investment banks were brought in to find a buyer, quietly at first, then with the particular urgency of people trying to save something before it was too late to save. Several weeks later, Daniel walked into Laura's office holding a folder marked confidential. He set it on her desk without a word. Inside were acquisition documents. At the top, the name of the company requesting negotiations. Cross Dynamics. Laura read it once, then closed the folder slowly, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. 3 years earlier she had walked out of that building carrying a cardboard box and nothing else. Now she was holding the paperwork to buy it. "Are you ready to go back?" Daniel asked quietly. Laura looked out the window for a long moment before she answered, "Yes." Then after a pause, "But not for revenge." She meant it. Whatever she was walking back into that boardroom for, it wasn't the satisfaction of watching Richard lose what he'd taken from her. It was something steadier than that, the chance to finish properly what she had started building the day she'd first walked through Cross Dynamics doors as a junior assistant who'd studied every department because she believed, even then, that the work mattered more than the title attached to it. The acquisition team scheduled the board meeting for the following week. Laura would walk through those doors once again, not with a resignation letter and not with a box of what remained of a career someone else had tried to erase, but with the authority to decide what came next for the company that had once decided, without asking her, that she wasn't worth keeping. Exactly 3 years to the day after she'd resigned, a black SUV pulled up outside Cross Dynamics headquarters. Employees gathered near the entrance the way they always did when something unusual was happening, and for a moment nobody understood what they were looking at. Then someone said her name, quietly, and it moved through the small crowd like a current. Laura Matthews stepped out. Elegant. Composed. Nothing about her rushed. She wasn't carrying a cardboard box this time. She was carrying acquisition documents. Former co-workers recognized her instantly. Whispers filled the lobby before she'd even reached the door. Laura's back. She walked through the same reception area she'd walked through 1,000 times before, past the same elevators, down the same hallways, and let herself remember all of it as she went. Her first day as a nervous junior assistant, the years of quietly saving accounts nobody else could, the morning she'd lost a promotion she'd earned twice over, the afternoon she'd carried her belongings out in a box and never looked back. This time nobody looked away. Employees straightened as she passed. A few smiled, unguarded. Somewhere behind her, she heard someone say she deserves this and didn't need to turn around to know they meant it. The boardroom doors opened onto a room already seated and waiting. Richard looked up first, and whatever confidence he'd carried into the room left his face the moment he saw her. Chairman William Cross rose slowly from his chair. The rest of the executives followed, one by one, not because protocol required it, but because every person in that room finally understood fully who had been sitting among them all along. Daniel led the negotiation, professional and unhurried. Laura spoke when it mattered, and when she did, there was no edge in it, no arrogance, no old scores being quietly settled under the language of business terms. She talked about saving jobs, rebuilding the culture Richard had hollowed out, restoring the client trust that had taken years to lose, investing seriously in the people who did the actual work. She set one condition. Every employee would keep their position if their performance justified it. Leadership, going forward, would be earned, not inherited. The room went very quiet. Richard understood exactly what that sentence meant, and exactly who it had been written for. Afterward, he found her alone near the elevators. He said something he'd never said to her or to anyone. "I thought your success came from luck." Laura considered him for a moment without malice. "No," she said. "It came from showing up every day." Richard apologized, plainly without excuses for the first time since she'd known him. Laura accepted it. Forgiveness didn't undo what came next. The acquisition closed within weeks, and Richard lost the position he had never actually earned in the first place. William stopped her before she left the building. He asked the only question that seemed to matter to him anymore. "Why didn't you try to embarrass us today?" "Because I stopped trying to prove my worth," Laura said, "the day I realized it was never yours to measure." William lowered his head. He understood, finally, that his greatest mistake hadn't been promoting his son. It had been failing for nearly a decade to see the person standing right in front of him. Months later, Cross Dynamics was a different company. Clients returned. Employees stayed. Innovation came back into rooms that had gone quiet under Richard's leadership. Merit, for the first time, was simply how the place worked. Laura made a point of mentoring the employees most likely to be overlooked, the ones without the right last name or the right connections, because she remembered exactly what that felt like. One afternoon, months after the acquisition, a young sales associate stood nervously in a familiar auditorium, waiting for a promotion announcement. Laura, now executive chairwoman, opened the envelope and read the name of the employee who had actually earned the role. The room broke into applause, real and unguarded. Laura watched it and remembered quietly the day her own name hadn't been called. This time, justice hadn't come through revenge. It had come through building the kind of company she had once needed someone to believe in. A title can be handed to someone. Respect cannot.